All right, let's now turn to status and resources, something which women seem to prioritize in men more than men prioritize in women. We'll look again at this large study that was done by Schwartz and colleagues. Just as they asked women and men about how willing they would be to marry somebody who was not good looking, they asked of status and resource related items. If you ask men and women, could you imagine marrying somebody who earns more than you? Almost all of them are okay with that. 96% of women, 93% of men. If you ask them, however, could you imagine marrying somebody who earns less than you? 91% of men are okay with that, but only 38% of women could imagine doing that. What if we ask about education? There, if you ask whether people would be able to imagine marrying somebody with more education, again, 96% of women and 95% of men are a-okay with that. What about marrying somebody who is less educated than you? 87% of men are okay with that, but only 43% of women are. What if you asked about holding regular employment? Well, 75% of men say they could imagine marrying somebody without regular employment, but only 28% of women could. We talked in one of the discussion classes about how changes in the labor market have led to the erosion of a lot of full-time, stable jobs for both men and women. This may have a disproportionate impact on the marriageability of men, which may lead to a surplus of unmarried single men, which may cause some problems in the future. Now, this was from the European study that was done by these authors. Is this something we see across cultures? Yes, it is. Though there's cultural variability, every single time this has been tested in a culture, you see this pattern of results where women care more about status and resources in their partners than do men. Now, there's a compelling argument to be made that this is just because of unequal socioeconomic statuses and control of wealth by men and women. As women command more wealth, we would expect that their reliance on men for financial resources would diminish. But as we talked about before, this is not actually what we see. We talked about that big 45 country study, which showed no effect of gender equality on this sex difference in mate preferences. Now, I will admit that this is a kind of an inconsistent literature. There's a lot of people who've tested this in various different ways, coming to somewhat mixed results, but the statistics have been refined over time. And the most recent study on this, well, the 45 country study was the most recent, but another one which came out last year actually is more statistically sophisticated than most of the other studies there. And it found the same thing. Here you can see, although women preferred mates with good earning capacity more than men did, and men preferred physically attractive mates more than women did, we found little evidence that these sex differences were smaller in countries with greater gender equality. And here's the diagram. This is a little messy, but what you can see is that that's the gender development index. The higher it goes, the more gender equality there is. For physical attractiveness, you see that those lines are basically parallel. Men, the blue line, care more about physical attractiveness regardless of how high you get on the gender development index, and women care less, and those lines are not coming together. You see the same thing for good earning capacity. Those lines, maybe they're tilting towards each other a little bit, but they are of a long way to go if they're ever going to converge. So that seems to be another consistent sex difference despite increases in gender equality. On the other hand, you don't see that for domestic skills. There you actually do see a convergence. As countries get more gender equal, men care less about the domestic skills of women, and women seem to care more about the domestic skills of men. So it isn't the case that we see no changes in mate preferences whatsoever as countries get more equal. We just don't see them on these two dimensions, which are suggested to have evolutionary bases. All right, now one interesting aspect of the sex differences on these particular issues is how they differ or don't differ depending on the intended duration of the mating situation you're in. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at men and women reporting the minimum earning capacity percentile, that is what proportion of the rest of the population does this person earn more than for various types of mating situations. You have for somebody that you're keen to marry, for somebody that you're going to go steady with as if you're living in the 50s, for somebody that you're going on a single date with, and for somebody that you're just having casual sex, what we would call short-term mating. You see across each of these categories, there is this sex difference. Yes, women care less about the earning capacity of somebody they're going to have casual sex with or go on a single date than somebody that they're going to marry. For somebody that they're going to marry, that person has basically got to be making a minimum more than 2/3 of the rest of the population. In all the cases, though, men care less than women. That's not the pattern we see for certain other dimensions. So here's the minimum acceptable IQ percentile. How smart does the person you're engaging in all these things have to be? Here's what you see from marriage. When it comes to long-term mating, men are just as choosy. These are not significantly different ratings. Men are just as choosy about the intelligence of the person that they're keen to marry as women are. Same story for going steady. Again, no difference between these two numbers. It's slightly lower than what you see for marriage, but it's not different between the men and the women. Where you do see the differences are slightly, you see them growing for a date, where men actually, in this case, care more. You still have to talk to your date. The big difference is in casual sex. There, men's standards for the intelligence of their partner that they're just going to sleep with are quite diminished compared to women. Women actually care more about the intelligence of a casual sex partner than they do of a date. And I'll leave you guys to think about why that's the case. But you do see that the pattern changes. And that brings up this general idea of long-term and short-term mating. Now, as with all the differences we're talking about, these are differences on average. These are overlapping distributions. It's not the case that all women are like X and all men are like Y. However, there does seem to be compelling evidence that on average, short-term mating is much more appealing to men than it is to women. And by short-term, we mean one-night stands. Here's what you see across cultures. Men, as we talked about last class, want more sex partners over time than women. When married, they're more likely to want to have an affair. They're more likely to actually have affairs. They're more likely to have fantasies about short-term sex or sex with strangers. They're less likely to regret a one-night stand than a woman who engaged in a one-night stand would be. They are less likely to say that the ideal outcome of a one-night stand is a long-term relationship. Women are more likely to say that that's what they would want to hook up to lead to. Men are more likely to say they want to hook up to lead to more hookups. Men are more likely to consume porn that has short-term sex without any relationship or context whatsoever. And men are, as we all know, more likely to be patrons of prostitutes across the world. Women seem to pursue short-term mating, but they do so for different motives. Now, what I'm not saying here is a point that Natalie Angier was criticizing in her optional reading from a previous class, where she said that what evolutionary psychology says is men are promiscuous, women are monogamous. That's not the case. Assuming equal sex ratios of heterosexual couples, there has to be equal amounts of short-term mating between men and women. Every time there's a short-term mating, a heterosexual short-term mating opportunity, it involves one man and one woman. They may interpret it differently. As Buss says in one of his articles, one person's short-term one-night stand might be another person's failure to launch a long-term relationship. But women and men engage in short-term mating at the same rate. What seems different is their motives to do so. So evolutionary psychology used to talk about this idea of the good genes hypothesis. In fact, I used to teach this. The general idea was that women have these dual motivations for mating. They're trying to find a long-term partner, but they're also trying to get the best genes. And as a result, in short-term mating situations, they try to secure the best genes, and then they try to secure the men who are willing to commit for long-term mating. This theory, as well as the evidence for it, there was all sorts of crazy studies about how women's preferences changed across the ovulatory cycle, such that when she was most likely to get pregnant, she'd like this type of man. When she was least likely to get pregnant, she'd like this other type of man that she'd be trying to get a long-term relationship with. Most of that research has proven unreliable, so I'm not going to teach this anymore, at least until we have a more definitive answer on this. What seems to be a more likely motivation for women's engaging in short-term mating is the mate switching hypothesis, or securing the possibility of a future long-term relationship. What does that mean? It means that what women are often, not always of course, there's a we just like sex argument to all of this, but oftentimes what women are doing is trying out another partner who they're lining up to see if they would be a viable long-term partner. That is one of the goals behind their short-term mating strategy. And one of the reasons we know that is because when women have affairs, when married women have affairs, it's usually because they're unhappy with their existing marriage relationship. That's not the case, surprisingly, with men. There is no difference in the marital happiness of men who have affairs than those who don't have affairs. Men have affairs because the opportunity presents itself, not because they're unhappy with their wife. For women, it seems like they're unhappy with their husband and possibly considering pairing up with this person that they're having an affair with. In fact, 79% of women who have affairs fall in love with their affair partner. And furthermore, women look for the same types of men for the short-term pairing as they do for the long-term pairing. We saw that in the previous chart. That's not the case with men. They look for different types of women in the short term than they do in the long term. What that means is that we can kind of look at a grid like this. Women's short-term and long-term strategies and ideal partners tend to be very similar. And men actually tend to be similar to women when they're looking for long-term partners. With the exception of these dimensions of physical attractiveness and importance of status and resources, men are choosy, like women, when it comes to long-term partners. They're looking for the same long-term qualities, things like intelligence, things like values, kindness. The outlier in this grid is male short-term mating. This seems to be a sort of a unique situation among this grid, where men have this extra motivation to pursue this particular type of women for short-term situations that they're not interested in turning into long-term partners. And all of this makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. We know that short-term mating is more adaptive for men. How do we know that? Because of Sultan Ismail Sharif. This man holds the current Guinness World Record for having the most children. He had somewhere between 868 and 1,171 children, not obviously from the same woman. And he is an illustration of the maximal reproductive returns, fitness returns you can get if you're a man inclined towards short-term mating. As hard as a woman tries, she will not be able to have a tenth of the number of children that Sharif had here. I don't know if he's related to me. Odds are yes. Now, as a result of that, it's extremely likely that men evolved to have more of a motivation towards short-term mating than did women. That's how evolutionary psychology works. There are certain behaviors which are adaptive, and we evolve a psychology which motivates us towards that through little emotional nudges. It makes that more appealing to us. If something is not going to be adaptive, in fact, if it's going to be maladaptive, we're going to evolve motivations to push us away from it. For men, because short-term mating tends to be an adaptive strategy, we were outfitted with evolved machinery to push us towards that, to make us want that, so we would pursue it. All right. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the sexual abyss. What do I mean by that? Well, there is a cost to overstating sex differences. And I started the lecture by talking about how evolutionary psychology, especially pop evolutionary psychology, tends to get overzealous when talking about sex differences. The problem is that if you do that, you risk essentializing the people who belong to these different sexes in a way that gets us to treat each other as others. And that's especially problematic when there are overlapping distributions between men and women. Many men are going to fall below many women, or many women are going to fall below many men on these different dimensions. There's going to be huge overlap. Also, we are more alike than we are different. Overstating the most gendered items is overstating the difference between men and women. But just like when we talked about social Darwinism and Lysenkoism, you can make errors, grave errors, in both directions by being both overzealous about evolution and underzealous about evolution. And so there's also a cost to understating the differences, pretending that they don't exist. And the cost is that it can lead us to failures to understand each other. Now, the example that I gave in my 102 class, those of you who've taken my 102 class might remember this example because it's a bit of a frivolous example, but it's kind of not a frivolous example. And that's of dick pics. So 53% of millennial women, I don't know what's going on with Gen Z, but this is my generation, 53% of millennial women have received a dick pic. Of those, the vast majority say they've received unsolicited ones. And the most common words they choose to describe these dick pics are, the very most common word is gross, then stupid, then sad, and then, credit where it's due, sexy. A small minority of women actually do enjoy even the unsolicited dick pics. But most women dislike them. So why are men sending them? Well, you could entertain maybe three, there may be others, but you could entertain three potential hypotheses as to why men send them. One is that they could be aggressive. They could be sent deliberately to upset women. Two, they could be selfish. Men are sending them to women in order to get sexual gratification themselves as exhibitionists. Or three, they could be misguided. They could think that they're actually pleasing women. This paper from last year by Flora Oswald and colleagues looked at these three explanations, and what they actually found most support for was for the misguided explanation. It wasn't aggressive, wasn't selfish. Men actually thought women liked these. So here you can see an excerpt. Dick pics may be an unfortunate side effect of 1.8 million years of human evolution. Men have evolved to overperceive sexual intent, something we talked about last class, a well-established finding in the evolutionary psychology literature. Modern men may overestimate women's interest in receiving nude imagery based on their own receptivity in reversed roles. So men think, I would like to see unsolicited pictures of women's genitals. They must want to see unsolicited pictures of my genitals. And so they might thus send dick pics as a projection of their own sexual desires onto women. This is a failure to understand that we are different. So the psychologists Catherine Salmon and anthropologist Don Simon wrote a book about women's erotica. And in that they said this. They said, to encounter erotica designed to appeal to the other sex is to gaze into the psychological abyss that separates the sexes. The contrasts between romance novels and porn videos are so numerous and profound that they can make one marvel that men and women ever get together at all, much less stay together and successfully rear children. The Canadian psychologist Steven Pinker, whose work we'll read later in the course, builds on this to say that the sexual abyss, by which he means this chasm of understanding between the sexes, may come from a parochial inability of men to conceive of a mind unlike theirs, a mind that finds the prospect of abrupt, unsolicited sex with a stranger to be repugnant rather than appealing. And so the implication of this is that this inability for us to recognize, even abstractly, this difference between male and female evolved minds can be a cause of at least some of the sexual conflict that we talked about last class. As a result, it's worth us honestly and deeply investigating these differences. We may find comfort and solidarity in the areas in which we discover we do actually overlap. And when it comes to the differences, I won't say that we should respect them, because there's no necessary reason for us to morally accept the differences. But in ciphering out the facts, we can at least try to hope to understand them.